After the sad news of the passing of Marilyn Lovell, we wanted to honor all the astronaut spouses. So today we're talking to some children of astronauts to find out what it was like for their non-astronaut parent.
Yes, our two guests today are Jessica Carr, daughter of Skylab 4 Commander Jerry Carr, and Bruce McCandless III, son of Bruce McCandless II, who performed the first untethered spacewalk.
Please keep letting us know your thoughts via our social media pages at Space and Things Podcast on Instagram, Threads, and Facebook, or via the contact form on our website.
And please consider joining us over at patreon.com/Space and Things. But right now, enjoy episode 158 of the Space and Things podcast.
Oh my God! Unbelievable! Unbelievable, but it is right this time.
You're listening to Space and Things with Emily Carney and Dave Giles.
I'm Emily Carney.
And I'm Dave Giles, and welcome to episode 158 of our podcast. Now, before we get started, I just want to thank those who responded to our Facebook post I put up on Monday talking about our Patreon page. As we mentioned on the podcast, we're trying to get to 100 patrons by show 200 in order for us to try and make this show a little more viable to carry on making it. We spent a lot of time making this, and time is getting a little bit more precious, so we're trying to make sure that that makes sense. We had 11 people sign up just after that one Facebook post, which puts us up to 65 people. So if anyone else would like to join, please head over to patreon.com/Space and Things. There's plenty of reasons to do it. Bonus content, prize draws, free merchandise, and you help us make this podcast. Anyway, it was great to get such a good response from people. So thank you very much. We've got 40 shows left before episode 200. And now we only need an extra 35 people to sign up. So thank you for all your support.
Yes, thank you.
It really does mean a hell of a lot because we do want to keep making this.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's crack on with this week's main feature. So as Emily said in the intro, last week there was some sad news in the world of spaceflight. Marilyn Lovell passed away at the age of 93. Marilyn had been married to Jim Lovell, the Apollo 13 commander, for 71 years, and their marriage is often held in high regard amongst us romantic folk. Of course, as we know, the first female NASA astronauts weren't announced till 1978, and the lives of the wives of the male astronauts have been portrayed many times in films and documentaries. So today we wanted to talk to some people who witnessed that lifestyle firsthand and find out a bit about what it would have been like to be an astro spouse in those early decades of spaceflight.
So today we're joined by Jessica Carr, daughter of Jerry Carr, the commander of Skylab 4 from 1973 to 74. We're also joined by Bruce McCandless III, son of Bruce McCandless II, who had to wait a lot longer for his first spaceflight, which was on the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1984. Both Jerry and Bruce were selected in the fifth group of astronauts in April 1966, so the family had front row seats for the Apollo program. While we're sure that things have changed a lot for modern astronaut families, and if we get a chance in the future, we might do an up-to-date version of this discussion. But finding out about the family lives of astronauts during this key period of spaceflight history is something we find absolutely fascinating, and those family members should definitely be included in the bigger story of that era.
Yeah, it's the first appearance on the podcast for Jessica, but you may remember Bruce joined us way back on episode 44 when we talked about his wonderful book, Wonders All Around, which is a must-read in my opinion, and it's all about his dad's life. Absolutely fascinating. Anyway, let's talk to Jessica and Bruce.
Time to shake off a case of the Thursdays and listen to Space and Things with Emily Carney and Dave Giles.
So welcome, Jessica. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, your parents became part of the NASA family in 1966 when your father was selected to be part of the original 19 astronaut group. Your father, of course, is Jerry Carr, the legendary Skylab astronaut. So did you have any awareness at the time, that your families lived in a kind of different bubble than other families, or did everything seem pretty normal to you?
It's a great question, and everything was normal. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't understand that Dad was something different than the other dads, because the other dads worked at the same place Dad did, right?
Yeah.
So. No, and I can tell you that my mother was very much about making our lives normal and including us in things so that we felt like this is how it was supposed to be. I literally had no idea what was happening. I was 2 when he got chosen, and I think I was 9 when he flew. I just had no idea.
How about you, Bruce? What's your answer? Welcome back as well. Welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah. Well, when my dad and Jessica's dad, I guess when they were selected, it was 1966. I was only 5, and really the only thing I knew was that I liked really big trucks. So there wasn't a lot of space consciousness for me. Probably the whole awareness of the NASA thing didn't set in until I was maybe 10, and by then it was too late. I mean, I sort of missed all the good stuff. And my folks, as I said in the book, they were pretty weren't anti-social exactly, but they were very wary of the whole NASA social circuit, and for different reasons. My dad was the kind of person who just couldn't stand to be still for very long, and the notion of standing around at a cocktail party with a Cuba Libre in his hand was sort of like, for him, being dipped in an acid bath. You could see him getting antsy, antsier the longer he stood there. And so he didn't like that. And my mom was beset by various anxieties related to, her social standing and her appearance and that sort of thing. And she was always, she was a very anxious person. Like me, she was capable of being miserable in all sorts of different circumstances. And she always felt like she was, didn't measure up to the astronaut wives and was inferior in some way. And so tried to stay out of those circles. And we had friends there in El Lago, as I'm sure the Carrs did too, who had nothing to do with the space program. And they sort of kept my parents grounded, I think. We lived a couple of streets away from Jessica and her family. And they were in kind of a rough neighborhood in El Lago. We tried to stay away from that area. There was, it's just the Lakeshore bunch. They were kind of a different crew. You had to be careful when you rode your bike through there to go to the Utotem.
The Utotem, yeah, right. I forgot about that.
So I don't think we had much awareness of it. That all sort of came later when my dad finally got his shuttle flights and the world seemed to right itself again.
All right. So last week, news broke that Marilyn Lovell, who was famously immortalized in the Apollo 13 movie, passed away at age 93. So she was portrayed as stoic during her husband's perilous mission. Now, your father's mission was obviously very different, but how did your mother cope with the stress of being in this kind of, public, unnatural limelight?
The astronaut wives are a tight group. And I can tell you that she was never alone. There was always somebody with her, and especially Beth Williams. They were besties. She was involved in launches prior, right? They just kind of all leaned on each other. And I think, did she have a meltdown at some point? I'm sure she did. I can tell you the stress level got really high when we found out that the splashdown was not going to be televised.
Interesting.
And we were not allowed to tell our father. So there is actually footage of us talking to Dad when he was on the carrier, and he's asking us about the splashdown, and we're all kind of going, yes, really cool, Dad. It looked really good. And you can see Mom just kind of giving us a little bit of a look going, don't say anything right now. So she was remarkably good, but I think she had a lot of teachers. She got to follow in the footsteps of some really phenomenal women that kind of showed her the ropes in how to handle stuff.
I guess the big difference with your dad's flight was the length of it compared to those previous flights. It was so much longer, breaking all the records at the time.
Yeah.
So obviously that would have put a lot more pressure on your mum. I'm wondering whether the family of the crews were particularly close during that time. Obviously you said there was a support network and your mum would have had friends, but were the three families very much together during the duration of the flight?
I don't remember correctly, but I don't think the Gibsons lived in El Lago.
Right.
And so the Pogues did. They live right down the street. So there was absolutely that rallying with the three families, but I wouldn't say we were always together or always intertwined, because it wasn't a sprint. It was a marathon. It was a long time. I can say that I do recall hanging with the Pogues more than I do recall hanging with the Gibsons. And that might have just been geography. But we were together at certain times and certain milestones. They would get us all together. But for the most part, I think it really was just the Pogues and us got together more than anything.
Yeah, obviously your dad's flight was a lot later, Bruce.
Yeah.
Were you still even in Houston when your dad flew, or were you off in England at that point?
I was over in your country. I was in
I thought so.
England in 1884. So I didn't see much of what my mom. I know we're talking about astronaut wives here. I don't want to stray too much from that. So I didn't really see much of her reaction to that flight, but I was with her in 1990 for STS-31 when Dad and the crew there went up to deploy the Hubble Space Telescope, and it was rough. It was sort of an exquisite type of torture to bring the wives out there to watch their husbands playing this game of Russian roulette with rockets, right? I mean, STS-31 went up in 1990. And in terms of the sequence of flights after the Challenger disaster, there hadn't been that many yet. So that memory was still fresh in everyone's mind, and it was tough on my mom to watch that. As I'm sure it was for Marilyn Lovell to watch when her husband went up.
Yeah.
I think it was 4 times. And not only do you have to watch because you're a good wife, but you have to look like you're enjoying yourself, or at least attentive, and you have to look like you know what you're doing and you're put together and that sort of thing. Because even at that time, there was at least some press interest and national interest in the flights. So it was an odd experience, I think, to be a wife of one of the astronauts who are going up on one of those big rockets. So.
For sure.
By 1990, were the family still when watching the launch? Were you still in the main viewing area, or were you taken somewhere separate?
We were on a rooftop somewhere. I think we were, it was still a situation where the family was pretty much taken care of. And at the time I was, 29, so I wasn't exactly a kid anymore, but I was still treated as one of the astronaut kids and allowed to take a tour and that sort of thing. So, and treated really well by NASA, I have to say. And my sister was there and various other family members. And again, all the stress adds up because my mom's got to look after the members of extended family and our neighbors and our friends who were there. And all the while in the back of her mind, she's waiting to see whether the rocket's actually going to make it up out of the lower atmosphere there and whether my dad's going to be okay. And so it was difficult for her, and there was some crying involved and I'm sure some sleepless nights. So.
All right. So this question is kind of will be a fun one. There have been several depictions of what astronaut wives were like in popular media, movies, books, television, whatever. Are there any misconceptions or perhaps misinformation you'd like to clear up about how things actually were versus how they've been portrayed?
I don't know that I can clear up a lot of them, but I can tell you I do recall as a child the women, very powerful, very strong, opinionated women. And I do recall there were some pretty serious chat sessions with the ladies that I don't think anybody would have expected. And actually those conversations still happen today. I think it's been a couple of years, but there was always an Astronaut Wives reunion.
Oh, nice.
And I had the honor of attending one. I can tell you at that one, the camaraderie and the conversation was pretty eye-opening. I was blown away. I won't talk about any specifics, but I will tell you that, behind the scenes, they had voices. They were very smart, strong women, and they played the role. They fought it, but they played the role. They played the role they were supposed to play. But I would say when they were being casual, it was kind of a different situation. When the cameras weren't rolling, it was different. So I think the biggest misconception is they were all just kind of smiling housewives. No, not really. A lot of them, once they were out of the limelight, they were able to explore their strengths and their courage and their intelligence, if you will. I mean, they just all became amazing women. They were amazing women, and they became even more amazing. I said, I went to I took my mother because she was too, not feeling comfortable going alone. She was too old. And it was eye-opening. It was crazy. And just talking to them, Harriet Isley, I remember having a conversation with her and my mouth would just drop. I was like, wow. Dottie Duke was always just nice as pie. Dottie Duke is Dottie Duke. She's what you see is what you get with her. She is literally that person. I think the biggest misconception is that they were all just smiling housewives. There was a lot of substance there. And I don't think a lot of them got a fair shake. And I'm not sure a lot of them still would talk about it because it wasn't about them. It was about their husbands.
I'm probably in the minority here, but I think Hollywood, Apollo 13, for example, does a pretty good job of portraying Marilyn Lovell and Mary Hayes and, the lives of those folks generally. I mean, it's a great movie. My parents liked it too, so it must have had some ring of authenticity.
Yeah.
Things were a little neater in those houses than they were in our houses. In our house, certainly, our house was always kind of a crazy place. My dad was big into wildlife rehabilitation, so we'd have hawks and snakes and things. And my mom, amongst her other duties, when my dad was gone, which she frequently was, she'd be responsible for feeding the hawk or the owls or the snakes or whatever. And that was. So I just say things were just messier. There's a great scene in Apollo 13 where one of Marilyn Lovell's daughters come out and she dressed for Halloween and she wants to, her mother thinks she's going to be a cheerleader, but she's actually going to be a hippie. And she comes out of her room, and she's in a fight with her mom, and her little sister says, she's not wearing a bra. You can see everything. And of course, she's just wearing a t-shirt and a vest. But, and Marilyn Lovell says, what about you, Jim? Can she wear this? And he says, oh, yeah, whatever. That seemed like a typical astronaut dad. But I'm sure that situation was played out not only in our houses, but, back in those days. So I think the movies do a pretty good job. And For All Mankind does a good job too. Yeah,
I think for the most part, there's one series which shall remain unnamed that I think did a poor job. But for the most part, the movies were very respectful. And those women deserve that respect. They deserve to have their story told in a way they were comfortable telling the story, not in a way somebody wanted to fictionalize it or romanticize it or anything. They were women and they were carrying the weight of the world, taking care of their families alone. They needed to be represented as, yes, they were happy, smiling people, but they were parents and they were people and they were strong women. And I do think the movies have done a decent job for the most part.
So we've had a question from one of our Patreon subscribers, Gillian Casey, and it's a perfect follow-up to something that Jessica has just said. So maybe this is one for you, Jessica. Did it ever feel like you were living in a single-parent household growing up with your fathers away so often? Do you think your mothers had more agency and independence than the average American wife did at the time?
I would say yes, they did. And I can say for certain that my mother did. Never resented my father being gone. I don't think she ever resented him being gone. It was the nature of the beast, but she absolutely did. She raised 6 kids on her own and she did an incredible job. Wow, and she really formed us. We got a lot from my father. He taught us a lot, but mom taught us a lot. And she made sure we were not isolated. She made sure we were included in everything that was going on because her kids are part of the process and part of the program. And she stood up for us a lot. We did a lot of stuff that felt normal. I know it now that it was not normal, but I know that I felt normal because mom said it was okay. Mom said we could do this stuff. And mom made sure we participated in the entire process.
All right. So one of our Patreon subscribers, John Wisenhunt, has asked the following question. So military families have to move quickly when the parent gets a new assignment. But as an astronaut, you all stayed in Houston for years. Do you think this relative stability helped offset the stresses of being a military astronaut family?
Yeah, I think so, because my brothers and sisters all experienced the moving before 66. I was stable at 66 in 66. So I didn't have to experience that upheaval, but I know it was a little taxing on mom and the other kids, but I think it absolutely stabilized our lives for sure.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. That's one consolation of being assigned to or being selected for the astronaut corps. You got to go live in you got to go live in Houston, or you had to go live in Houston, depending on your perspective.
I was plucked from California. I had to go to Houston.
Right. Yeah. And it helped because obviously in the military, you're moving every year or two. And, the wife, of course, has to handle the logistics of moving everybody, pack it up, moving the dog and the kids, and then getting them settled into school and trying to make friends and trying to make sure your kids can make friends. And John, that's a good question. And it was a big consolation of being in the program. And, I got to where I've had the same set of creepy friends for years and years and still have some of them. So I'm grateful for that.
So a lot of us have heard how hard or difficult it was to be the spouse of an astronaut. So tell us some good memories about you and your family, how that are related to your father's mission. Was there anything, particularly exciting or kind of positive that you remember?
Bruce and I lived in an amazing neighborhood. The parents would open the front door and let us go. And I think we were gone all day, and then we'd come back. So we were with our friends and we were active and we were always doing things. The positive part of it, I think, is just that we did have a father and we did get to participate with him, mowing the lawn, putting the tool back where you got it from, that kind of stuff.
Right.
But as kids, the positive part was we were just in a safe environment, regardless of what your father did in the program. We were in a very safe environment and we just had this eclectic group of people around us all the time. And it was, we got social skills from that. I think we actually learned how to behave and be a kind person by dealing with all different types of people, kids and adults. We were thrust into adult situations where we had to behave. We were seen, but we had to behave. We knew the consequences of not behaving. That was pretty swift. The positive experiences were just literally having the best childhood I think I could have ever had, with amazing friends and people around us. I just super fond memories of everybody getting together all the time. Big extended families, big extended family events, just good times.
Yeah. So, a couple of different answers to that for the wives. And I'll talk about my mom in particular. My mother was a small town girl from New Jersey. She didn't particularly ever want or care about any of the lunar injections or missions to Mars, that sort of thing. And she was always ambivalent about the possibility that the spotlight would be on her, or that she would have to live up to some sort of notion of what the ideal astronaut wife was, or God forbid that her kids would be held up as some sort of model for how kids should act, because we were awful.
Yeah.
But having said that, and she had to deal with all the things that the astronaut wives had to deal with, which was worrying that that her husband was going to be killed. I mean, the wives of fighter pilots and jet pilots had to worry about that anyway. But in this case, if a husband was going to be killed, it was going to be very public and it was going to be very awful. And she had to worry about what happens when that occurs. What if I'm there? What if I'm watching that? Am I going to do something that embarrasses myself? Am I going to then be exposed to this sort of great oceanic well of grief that causes me to do something that I will lose my composure, that I'll be like, Jackie Kennedy climbing back over the trunk of the car to try to retrieve part of her husband's body. For women of that era, composure and looking like you knew what you were doing was super important. And I think she was terrified of sort of finding herself on the stage of a Greek tragedy. And so she was very worried about that. Those wives, they were pretty amazing because, they were able to do all kinds of things. And the analogy, I guess, is like the duck on the pond. You see the duck sort of gliding across the pond while underneath its legs are frantically moving. And I mentioned this to Emily, but I always felt like, my mom was 2 carpools away from crazy. She was, there were so many things the wives had to do. They had to run the household, they had to get kids to school, they had to look after themselves and make the meals and wash the grades and be there for their husbands. And when the husbands were off, whatever else they were doing, they were typically doing exactly what they wanted to do. I mean, they'd always wanted to fly. They'd always wanted to be astronauts. They had groupies. They were fawned upon by the press, and NASA treated them very well. And the wives got very little of that. They were often worried about what their husbands were up to. And the husbands weren't around very much. I mean, I read something that an interview with Betty Grissom not too long ago. Well, the interview was actually from a long time ago, but I read it recently. And she said that she figured at one point Gus Grissom was home maybe 60 days out of the year. And that's not how marriage typically works. To make it worse, the culture was changing. I mean, no-fault divorce was becoming a thing, and kids were starting to get into drugs. And we were finding out horrible things about what was going on in Vietnam. And so these women were they were having to deal with all kinds of things that, and it's a wonder there aren't more stories about the women checking themselves into clinics of various sorts or going on rampages. I mean, I think there was always that possibility in our family anyway. I don't know if that answers your question, but we're talking about consolation. We're saying good things about the life. Yes. For my mother, it was one thing, it was meeting John Wayne. And I think it was in 1969, they all went out to, after the Apollo 11 mission, as you may recall, there was this 3-city celebration. They took their astronauts to New York City, and then they flew them to Chicago and finally to LA the same day and had all these celebrations. And President Nixon had a state dinner out in Los Angeles. I say state, it may also have been a steak dinner. And he awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom to the astronauts. And a lot of the astronauts were there, and various showbiz people were there. Werner von Braun was there, and Red Skelton and Spiro Agnew, having been a fun table to be at. I think that's when she met John Wayne. I'm not sure, but that's a memory that she always had. And she got to do a lot of fun stuff. She got to go fly on the Aeroflot when it was first becoming an airline that went to the West. So there were some cool things you got to do. Was it worth it? I don't know. You'd have to. My mom's passed on now. I think most days she would say it was worth it. Some days she might have said, I don't know.
Yeah,
might have stayed in Newark.
Yeah. Jess, I want to bring up something you kind of mentioned earlier about how the wives were a very close-knit group. Particularly, your mother was part of that tight-knit group. And you were a lot younger than Bruce when your dad flew, so you've got a different perspective. And I'm wondering at what point, or if you ever sat down with your mother to have that conversation of what was it like, and can you ever have that conversation, or is a parent always going to be a little bit closed off to having that conversation because it may have been, as Bruce has just pointed out, so close to being crazy in so many ways. Did she maintain that composure all the way through it, or did she ever let her guard down with you and say, do you know what, that was hard?
Yeah, she did later in life, and especially after I had the privilege of escorting her to the Astronaut Wives reunion. I learned a lot. We spent a lot of time together, which we didn't traditionally do. And she started sharing, she started talking, and I started asking questions. And then it was even cooler at the reunion. I was able to sit with these women and just have a conversation. It was a closed door conversation, and they were talking, and they were not shy about how tough it was. They were those mama grizzlies too. They were worried about the women, like Bruce's mom. They were worried that those women needed a support infrastructure because they just didn't like the limelight. They didn't like any of it. They just did it because they had to be, smile and be proud, and they weren't. She did start sharing a lot of it. I probably wouldn't share, but these women, they talk. Like I said, they're a tight group, man. And when they get together, they throw down and they have good conversations. And she did start sharing stuff. She actually wrote some stuff down for me too, and started sending me stories, because I said, Ma, we don't talk a lot, so you need to share.
Mm.
There's a lot to say, and I don't know that we'll ever know the whole story behind the courage and strength of these women that were behind these men, because it was a lot. And a different world. Women didn't have to shoulder so much. And they shouldered everything from child rearing to buying the house to cooking and cleaning and everything without a husband around. And so I hope that answers. I don't know. Yeah. She did start talking, and I did appreciate it. I have such a profound gratitude for that, because these women were just moms to me. They were just moms. That's how I knew them. And then to see them as women, strong women, was really awesome. And to hear some of the stories and hear some of the heartache and heartbreak. I never knew the full story behind Beth Williams, and she was a good friend of our family. We were tight. And I didn't learn a lot about her until much later. She was just Beth. She was just Beth. But that is a badass woman right there. She is awesome. There's a lot of stories out there. I would hope that one day we could hear them.
But equally, if they remain private, then that's absolutely fine as well. Which is
exactly.
It's one of those, of course, for people like Emily and I, it would be wonderful to find out this stuff, but it's none of our business. But we just ask the questions, of course.
Right.
So I don't expect either of you to know what it's like to be a spouse of an astronaut these days. But if you could recommend something to be different for the current crop compared to what it was like for your mums, what would you want to be different? Less media coverage, less limelight, or is there something perhaps else that you think, I wish my mum didn't have to go through that?
Wow.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I don't know what the current spouses go through, and I don't know whether to include, suborbital missions from Blue Origin, or I think it's
right.
I think it's changed quite a bit. I think my mom probably could have used some counseling up to, during, maybe even after the launches she saw. I don't know of anything other than that. I mean, NASA would assign the astronauts to sort of go around with the family and the spouses, and that was helpful. And maybe some counseling. I guess that's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah, that's it's a great question, but it's a very difficult question because I don't have any other perspective, right? But I would say counseling is probably a really big thing that I wish there was more therapeutic interaction from NASA with the spouses and the families. We all got assigned reps and we had conversations, but it was kind of all behave, smile.
Actually, one thing that astronaut spouses of my mom's group or generation had to deal with also was this notion that if your husband did die in a rocket accident on one of his missions, there wasn't going to be much use for you after that. NASA wasn't going to have much to do with you.
Yes.
And this was pointed up when Betty Grissom filed her lawsuit in 1971 against North American Rockwell. Yeah, at the time, she sued for $10 million. At the time, it was the biggest product liability suit that had ever been brought in the U.S. at least, and it was sort of a very divisive thing to do. I know my dad was aghast. I think my mom was more sympathetic, but it was seen as sort of a blow against NASA, at least as much as it was against North American Rockwell. part of her lawsuit was dismissed on statute of limitations grounds, but another part survived, and I think she eventually settled with the company for $350,000 or something like that. And the wives of the other astronauts, as I understand it, didn't file suit, but actually were awarded roughly similar settlements. Maybe North American Rockwell was afraid that it wouldn't be sued. And of course, that's not good publicity to be sued by astronaut wives. But Betty Grissom, she went on to write a book, and she said, look, after this happened, NASA had no use for me, and some of the astronauts had no use for me.
That's correct.
And, to hell with them. And so this was something that if you had a husband who was going to be flying, you had to worry about, hey, secondary to my husband's life, of course, but what happens to me?
Yeah.
Where do I go? And so that was another thing that sort of weighed on people's mind, or weighed on some of these spouses' minds, I think.
I hate to jump in, but maybe it's because having those people around reminded them of death. Does that make sense? That's messed up in a way, because I'm like, when someone dies, it should be the opposite. You should be supporting the person who's grieving. But I think their attitude was, well, this person reminds us of this dead person. And it's like, what?
I mean, I'm sure there were some NASA folks were very helpful, and others maybe weren't. But I suspect there was some of that attitude that, in fact, Betty Grissom said, hey, there was some trip that some of the wives were going to go on, and they said, let's not bring the widows. We want to have fun, which is, who knows if that's true, but it's sort of something that I know my mom would have thought of and would have worried her.
So what are some things that you'd like the listeners to know and remember about the real astronaut wives?
They were people.
Well, as opposed to the movie wives, or the
real
ones.
housewives.
The real ones, not the movie or TV, or not even necessarily the book ones.
This makes me think of a new TV show idea, that the Real Housewives of El Lago.
Right.
Yeah. So I was gonna bring this up. Jessica and I lived in El Lago, as you point out, but the real astronauts, the high class astronauts, lived over in Timber Cove, and
yeah, they did. NASA Bay and Timber Cove. They were like, woo.
I know you Jessica, you just had to walk down the street to that boat landing where you lived, and we had a similar one, and you could look across the lake there, and you just knew that John Glenn and Jim Lovell and those guys were out in their boats and slathering suntan lotion on their bodies, and there's
So
music
true.
playing. You could almost hear the music. We'd stand there like Jay Gatsby looking out over Long Island Sound.
So true.
And,
So true.
And we were sort of the low class astronaut families.
Yeah,
We could dream.
exactly. We slummed a bit in our day.
They had a bougie astronaut division. That's hysterical. I was not aware of this.
Yeah. No, it was about Timber Cove. Timber Cove was the Beverly Hills.
That was
Yeah.
the swanky part. That was because it was across the lake, very isolated.
They had a pool over there that was shaped like a Gemini capsule, I think, or Mercury
I
capsule.
think, yeah.
And they were real proud of themselves. And of course, it was hard to swim laps because people would go into the escape tower and they'd run into each other. That sort of thing. I'm
That's
kidding about
funny. Oh, okay. For a second, I was like, really? That's funny.
Well, we ended up with Neil Armstrong, so I think we trumped the Timber Cove guys anyway.
We're doing good. Our side did good. Our side of the lake did good.
I didn't know there was a bougie area, but that makes sense. There's always a bougie area. So, there's always the regular division and the bougie division. And go back to the question. I got a little off topic.
Oh, sorry.
No, I got off topic
lost the
because
question.
I was thinking about I did not know they had a bougie area. Wow.
Timber Cove. Now you know.
Yeah. Now I know. Now I'm aware. Now I'm gonna go hang out there because it's where all the rich. I'll get the good candy there.
They'll check your ID, I'm afraid.
They'll check
Yeah,
my
they
ID.
might.
Yeah.
So you were asking about, so we have out of JSC, they have the grove with the trees for the astronauts who died. And that's great, but there needs to be some sort of monument for the women, the spouses generally. And, I would suggest maybe a steel girder, bent in the middle, called stress or something like that, because,
Oh man, that's
I agree.
Let's do this. That's a great idea. The women should be getting something as well. They were all part of this.
Yeah. They bent, but they never broke.
Exactly. That's it. You're onto something there.
You should be an author, Bruce. Some of this stuff is
I'm working on it. I'm working on
Right.
it.
Wow.
I did want to say one thing. Like most women, the astronauts' wives were smart and tough and gentle and did much more than was expected of them. We didn't deserve them, and frankly, in most cases, neither did their husbands.
True.
No.
Preach,
Yeah,
brother.
I don't know. I mean,
That's the truth.
I'm bloviating there.
No,
but-
it was something. I mean, everybody was mom. We were all a tribe, and they were the ones that held us together. They were the ones that brought the really cool food, to the launch parties. And like Dion Stafford's mom always brought, I think they call it this chocolate scrub cake, because the missions would always get scrubbed when she brought the cake. And
Oh no!
we
Yeah.
it was just this collective being of mom. They were the strength behind those men and those families. They were it. They deserve credit.
Yeah. No, those are great times for sure.
All right.
It's great that you both think of it in terms of being great times as well, because I don't know, it just feels like it's often portrayed as being so traumatic. So to hear that actually it was good. It's good. It's what we wanted.
Yeah, we wanted to hear some positive things, because, as you know, that the metaphor of the steel girder with the bent but not broken.
Yeah.
That's a really good metaphor, because I'm sure. I mean, the stress.
Absolutely.
I can't imagine this. I have a husband, and the idea of him going on top of a rocket absolutely horrifies me. And I've threatened before, like, man, I'm going to sign up on one of them commercial missions, and my husband. And I'm thinking, oh, my husband will support that. And Steve's like, no, you're not doing that. And I'm like, why? And then I realized because he's absolutely terrible. No, and then I'm like, because he doesn't want me to die. That's because one time I was joking with him, and it was like, I don't want, and he was serious. He's like, I don't want you to do any of that stuff, And I know you love space, but I don't want you to do that. And then I realized it was because, and there was that part of me, like, he's trying to hold me back. But no, and then I realized, then I realized he doesn't want me to get killed, and he doesn't want to be the one who has to watch that and be like, oh yeah, she just died in public, so I can't imagine as a wife with kids, watching that. So yeah, that's a good metaphor.
Right.
Well, Dave, I know it's late over there for you. Are you? Can you put together your thoughts about whether you'd go into space or whether Lucy would be okay with you doing it? Or
I think she'd be all right with it, because she knows I think she knows that it's what I really want, and therefore I feel like she would be fairly supportive of it, even though she'd probably be very scared. I think what was interesting is we spoke to Chris Zembrowski last week, who was on Inspiration 4, so he's been up on one of the SpaceX Dragons, so fairly recent astronaut. And I know from watching a documentary about that his wife was very scared, and he brought it up in the interview that they were very aware that the families didn't want to be like the Challenger families, where they were on display.
Oh God, yes, horrific.
And they were very much like aware of the risks. And if it goes wrong, we want to deal with this privately. We don't want to have to go through that. But certainly watching the Inspiration 4 documentary, and she was petrified. She afterwards she said, I don't know if I really want him to do this, but I know it means a lot to him. And I think it's a different conversation these days than it would have been in the 50s and 60s and 70s, for sure.
Yep.
I mean, Emily, personally, I would love to see Steve go to space. I think that would be really entertaining.
Yes. Sometimes I'd like him to go to space too. Sometimes I would. I'm kidding. That's awful. He's going to listen to this and be like, why did she say this crap? But no. I think Steve, if I don't think this will ever happen, but if I were to get the opportunity to go to space, I think he would ultimately be like, oh, okay. But I think he would be petrified. I think he would be like, absolutely petrified, so, but he wouldn't want to show it to people. He would just sort of, because I know how he is. He's one of those people, he's just not going to say it, but he'll be inside, he'll be petrified. But I don't know. I think Steve's a secret space nerd. He just doesn't I think he likes it more than he lets on. Because
absolutely.
I think he
absolutely
likes it.
does.
He knows a lot too. Like sometimes we'll be talking, I'm like, how does he know this? And then I'm like, of course he knows this. He's in, of course he knows this. He overhears everything, Yeah.
Bruce, I want to spin that back at you. So obviously you asked how Lucy would feel if I went, but the two of you both experienced being a family member firsthand, and you witnessed your parents be the spouse or the astronaut. Does that experience of seeing that happen make you want to or not be either the astronaut or the spouse even more? How would you, like, when you're talking to someone like me who's saying I would go, would you say, yeah, actually, you probably don't want to because you're going to put your family through this, that, and the other? Or what does it make you say, yeah, it's really cool, I support that? How does that, the fact that you've got a first-hand experience, does that change your perspective on that question?
Jessica?
Well, I mean,
that's a tough one.
I kind of thought it might be kind of cool to go, but I'm kind of chicken. I don't know that I want to do what Dad did. Strap myself to a bomb, but I think if my partner wanted to do it, I'd say right on. Let's do it. Let's do it. You're gonna love it.
Amazing.
But I'm too chicken. I would probably say, yeah, I'll do it, no problem. And then time comes, I'm like, no, really, I don't want to do it.
Bruce?
Yeah, no, I'd go in a minute, and I'd like to announce publicly that I'm available. And
I know, right? I thought about reaching out to Bezos, going, "Hey, brother."
I've got a resting heart rate of about 47.
Wow, that's good though. Holy snikes!
I'm in good shape. And if anyone's interested, I'd be happy to go. I'll take pictures if that would be helpful.
Please do.
There you go.
What if Patty turned around and said she wanted to go? How would you feel about that?
Can't go. No, she's
too much to do.
Yeah, she somehow or other we managed to replicate the whole astronaut thing for no good reason. But she does way more than her share, so she couldn't go. I'm afraid. Sorry, NASA.
What if one of your daughters wanted to go? How would you feel about that?
I think that would be catastrophic for the entire space program. So no, I would not allow that to happen.
Perfect. And on that note, I think we should end.
Goodness gracious.
Just a vehicle for space memes. It's Space and Things with Emily Carney and Dave Giles.
All right. Well, I don't know where to start.
I don't know where to start either. That was one of those interviews that had just a bit of everything, really. I laughed, I cried, I smiled. I thought deep thoughts about life, love, and loss. I think we really have to give a lot of thanks to Jessica and Bruce for their honesty there and for opening up. Talking about your family for a bunch of strangers can't be easy. And that really was amazing. I love that Jessica and her mother, Joann, got to spend those moments together as Joann got older. Going to the reunion, the Astronaut Wives, just amazing. I love that story, and the fact they got to do that is wonderful. And I love that Bruce within that was so open about the struggles of Bernice, his mother. The 2 carpool rides away from crazy. That was the quote that really stood out for me. And perhaps it highlights how hard it must have been for those women. I think it's worth bringing up at this point some stories about 2 of the other Apollo wives. I'm going to put a trigger warning here, maybe a little bit upsetting for some, so feel free to skip ahead 30 seconds if you need to. So Patricia White, it was the wife of Ed White. Ed White obviously died in the Apollo 1 fire. She never really recovered from that. Although she did remarry, it said that she was never the same after the fire, and unfortunately took her own life in 1983. Susan Borman, who was the wife of Frank Borman, suffered from depression and alcoholism. She covered it well, but it later came out that she was suffering from those things. And it's well reported that Frank acknowledged that his focus on the mission and of Project Apollo contributed to that. They stayed married right until her death in 2021 and worked through those problems together, similar to Jim and Marilyn, a couple that I personally put on a pedestal. Perhaps we should never do that, but certainly what I do. So both of those stories highlight just how severe the pressures of being an astronaut spouse were back then. I think that the death of Marilyn Lovell last week certainly gives us an opportunity to try and address the fact that we don't give the women standing next to the men of Apollo enough credit for the roles they played in making it happen. And not just the roles, but the toll it took on them and on their own lives. Personally, I really do like that idea that Bruce had for the memorial. The steel girdle, I mean, that was a fantastic metaphor. Yeah. Absolutely fantastic.
And plus the 50s and 60s, obviously not a great time for women's rights, but I think what Bruce said, the women had to be very poised on the outside. They had to keep control of themselves. And that was a really big thing in the 50s and 60s with women in general. You couldn't have a crazy moment and go nuts and start screaming or anything like that. I think nowadays women are more, in the United States, are more encouraged, I hope, to sort of, okay, we can go to therapy. We're encouraged to do certain things, to get those things out, whereas back then, if you went to therapy, oh my God, you're crazy. That had a stigma attached to it. That does speak to what American culture was like and how it sort of changed over the years. And, in certain ways, these women, like Jessica brought up, these women were a big support to each other, and they had to be very strong because they were probably dealing with so much under the surface but on the outside, they had to be, poised without, your hair perfect, all that stuff.
Yeah, completely. I mean, Annie Glenn, who was married to John Glenn, she had a stutter. That was well hidden because you couldn't show any vulnerability as an astronaut's wife. Also, just for those people who aren't aware, Jess brought up Beth Williams a few times.
Yes.
And that was the wife of Clifton Williams, who was one of the Group 3 astronauts who died in a plane crash in 1967. 67, I think it was, wasn't it? At the age of 35.
I think 66 or 67, yeah. I think 67. Yeah, that was a bad year.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, 8 months, 10 months after Apollo 1 and another astronaut of that community dying, and another woman that would have to get that support from that network. And I mean, as well, I'm fairly sure that Beth gave birth after Clifton died as well to their second child, which is next level in craziness, and can't imagine those emotions. But just for those of you who aren't aware, that was who was being referred to there. But what a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I'm really glad we did that. And I'm actually sorry that it took the death of Marilyn Lovell for us to think about having a conversation like this, because I feel like we should have done this before.
I agree. Yeah, I think we should have done this probably way earlier, but we've done it now, and I think that the discussion we just had was awesome, and it was something that is really overdue, and that it was really obviously needed. And I think our listeners will be surprised in a way from listening to it. I think that, they'll be surprised, and hopefully they'll find out something they didn't know before about these, amazing women who really kept everything together.
Yeah. The story that really got me in there in particular was Bruce bringing up the idea that the thing that scared the women, one of the things that scared the women, was that NASA wouldn't have a use for them. And that experience that Betty Grissom had and what she expressed in her book, that to me was really quite powerful and was something that I hadn't considered before. And I think that's another thing that is worth having that conversation, just to hear that and earn a new level of respect for those women for that reason alone, not withholding the importance of anything else that was discussed about there.
Yeah, I think the culture at NASA really changed between, Apollo 1 and Columbia. Like, I think around Columbia, I think the NASA culture dealt with it a little differently. I think they were probably more supportive to the, the families and the spouses during that time. I've gotten the feeling they were a little more, supportive, but I feel with Apollo 1, they just tried to get the wives out of the picture. And that kind of also tells you a lot of what death was dealt with like back in the 60s. It was kind of like this scary thing, and we just don't want to talk about it. Whereas I think as the decades advanced, things changed a little bit, and I think NASA became aware, we've got to deal with this issue that is a very real issue that can happen during space flight. We got to deal with this a lot differently because the old way does not work.
Post-Challenger, they did move the families away. As Bruce said, they were on a rooftop rather than being in the public gallery for launches, which I think was certainly a step. I would certainly recommend people listen to Clayton Anderson's podcast, the Ordinary Spaceman podcast. Every episode he's interviewing another person in his life, and there's two or three episodes where it's just him and his wife sitting there having a conversation. So this is a shuttle astronaut around the era of Columbia, and we had Clayton on at one point. I think we kind of talked about this as well, but they talk really honestly about what happened in Columbia and how the families were treated, but also how that affected the family when Clayton then launched. And I think if you want to hear a more modern account of what it was like, noughties era, shuttle era, later shuttle era, I think that's a fantastic listen. When you've literally got the astronaut and their wife having a conversation. It's really fascinating, and I was moved to tears listening to that conversation. So I will post a link to that in the show notes. And as always, I will post all relevant links about this interview in the show notes, which is www.spaceandthingspodcast.com. You'll find them on there. Look in the archive, or click on the link that will take you directly to the page relevant to this episode. If you look for that link in the description of this podcast within your podcast provider, I know that sounds convoluted, but I can't think of a better way of saying it. Anyway, you'll find the show notes, which will include links to social media and other things, including Bruce's book, which is a must-read, absolute must-read. Also, head over to patreon.com if you want to watch the full unedited video of that interview. Some people like doing that. And also there's a couple of questions which I edited out for time purposes, so we call them bonus questions, and they're over on that. There's a separate video, so you don't have to watch the whole thing to find the ones that I took out. So head over to patreon.com/space and things for that.
Better than eating broccoli, it's Space and Things with Emily Carney and Dave Giles.
So, Emily, what caught your eye in spaceflight this last week?
Really just one thing. Crew 6 re-entered right over my house. So
I saw your video. Amazing. So cool.
Yeah, it was freaking awesome. I went outside at the correct time, and there it was, big yellowish streak coming overhead, and I was like, oh my God, that's it?
Sonic boom?
5 minutes later, we heard faint sonic booms, because by that point, it was about in Jacksonville. And that point, right. Jacksonville's a little ways out from here. It's probably 6 hours, I'm guessing, from here. Oh my God, it was freaking awesome. I've never seen a re-entry before. Everybody, I hope, gets the chance to see that. I just feel a little bit selfish because, I walked right outside of my porch, and so like I just go outside as one does, and just there it is, And it was really neat to see the other side of a space mission, because I'm used to seeing launches, which is I feel like I'm bragging, like, yeah, I'm used to seeing launches. It's not a big deal. But I live in Florida, so I'm used to seeing space launches, but seeing a re-entry was something brand new for me. I don't even know if I've seen a shuttle re-entry, honestly. I've heard a shuttle re-entry plenty of times back in the day because you could hear them coming over here, but I don't think I ever went outside to see one, but this was just spectacular. And obviously I took some very amateurish video of it, but it was just mind-blowing. So that's really what's been on my mind this week.
Amazing.
Yeah, that was it was crazy. So what about you, Dave? What have you been looking at?
Just a good week for headlines. SpaceX recorded their 62nd orbital flight in a calendar year, and we're only at the beginning of September. That's a new record for them, and I'm guessing for any company, as far as I'm aware. And we laughed a couple of years ago when Elon said that he was going to do 100 in a year. We were like, yeah, we're years away from that. Well, maybe not. Anyway, Ingenuity, the little helicopter on Mars, had its 56th flight. Lovely. Ariane 6, the Europeans' new rocket, had a pretty important test. This rocket's been delayed. It had a pretty important test this week, and it was successful. Apparently, we're going to find out when the first launch is going to be at the end of October. There's going to be a press conference. So hopefully we'll know more about Ariane 6 and its first launch. Fantastic. India had another good week. They launched their solar observatory. So the Indian space program is really, really, really getting a lot of achievements ticked off at the moment.
They're heating up.
That's
big
really
time.
exciting.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I sent an email to them this week to see if we can get someone on the podcast. Hopefully, fingers crossed. No reply yet, but I'm sure they're very busy right now.
Yeah, they've got a bit going on at the moment. But we would love, we would love that. That would be incredible to talk to the people of that program.
And the other thing that caught my eye, which is perhaps not such a good news, is that a Soviet satellite collided with another Soviet satellite or something else. And this is about 400, 500 miles up. So not in a place where it's going to decay anytime soon. So we saw a really bad case of space debris causing problems. And of course, when these things collide, you get a lot more dangerous debris. So obviously we spoke about this at length and we continue to bring this up, but yeah, I will post links to those stories for you to read in the show notes, so check them out.
Where mispronunciation is entertainment. It's Space and Things.
Right, thanks so much for joining us this week. We hope you enjoyed the podcast. It may sound like we've rushed through the tops and the tails, but it really was because that interview, which we always do the interview first, and that was such a good interview and long that we didn't want to have to take too much out. So we kind of have rushed through the other bits, but we'll be back next week with some more. I've got a few trips away coming up over the next couple of months, so we're trying to record a few episodes a week right now. So hopefully I've not let anything slip within this edit, but do continue to let us know what you think. If you listen on Spotify, please leave your comments underneath the episode on the app. There's a Q&A box, and I've finally figured out how to read those comments. I finally found out where they go. So if you're a Spotify user and you do that, I can now read, and I think I can even reply. I'm not sure, but perhaps if you leave a good comment on there, similar to Apple iTunes reviews, we will read them out if they're worthy of being read out, good or bad. We'd love to get your feedback, so please do continue to get in contact.
Yes, and please give us a review if you haven't done so already. Look for the option to leave a rating or review within your podcast app. It really does help us pop out among the many science podcasts that exist. But don't forget, in space, no one can hear you me.
Things in space, space and things. Okay.